If you ever want to know who really runs your neighborhood, don't look at the bylaws, wait until 3 a.m. and listen for what breaks. That's when I heard it, the sharp crack of treated wood splitting clean under pressure, echoing across my yard like a warning shot I didn't need explained. I didn't rush outside. I didn't call anyone. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, breathing in that faint smell of fresh-cut lumber drifting through my open window, already knowing exactly what I'd find when the sun came up. By 6:30 a.m., the Texas heat was already climbing past 80 degrees, and my backyard looked like a ghost outline of what used to be mine. My fence, every post I'd set myself, every panel I'd measured down to the inch, was gone. Not knocked over. Not damaged. Removed. Clean. Precise. Professional. The gravel under my boots crunched louder than usual as I walked the perimeter, noticing the perfectly spaced gaps where each 4x4 post had stood, like someone had followed a blueprint. That's when I saw her. Linda Harper. Standing right at the edge of my property like she owned the sunrise, white SUV idling behind her, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It never did. "Mr. Walker," she said, voice smooth as polished glass, "your previous fence was in violation of community aesthetic standards. Consider this an opportunity to rebuild correctly." I could still smell the sawdust in the air. Fresh. Recent. Intentional. I didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. I just looked past her, at the clean line where my boundary used to stand, and nodded once like I was taking notes. Because here's the thing Linda didn't understand, and what the entire HOA board was about to learn the hard way: I don't rebuild problems. I redesign them. See, they thought they erased a fence. They thought they reset the game back to zero. What they didn't know was that I had already spent the last 6 months studying every inch of this property, every easement, every county ordinance, every line buried in documents nobody bothers to read. The morning air felt still, like the world was holding its breath. Linda gave me one last satisfied glance before turning back toward her SUV, heels clicking against the pavement with that same quiet confidence people have when they think they've already won. I watched her drive off without saying a word. Then I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened a folder I'd labeled Phase 2, and looked at the plans I'd been waiting to use. Because the next time they came onto my property, it wouldn't be a fence they were dealing with anymore. By the time the sun climbed high enough to bake the gravel into that familiar dry heat, I was already halfway through my second cup of coffee, standing where my fence used to be, replaying every detail in my head like a blueprint I had memorized years ago. My name is Ethan Walker, I am 38 years old, and I have spent the last 15 years designing infrastructure that most people never notice unless it fails. Roads, drainage systems, retaining walls, property boundaries. Lines that matter. Lines that keep order. And that fence was never just a fence. It was the first thing I built after my divorce, 12 months of quiet weekends with a tape measure in one hand and a post level in the other, setting each section exactly on the surveyed boundary my grandfather had marked decades ago. This land sits just outside Austin, 47 acres that have been in my family since 1962, passed down with more care than paperwork. My grandfather used to say land does not argue, people do, and if you want peace, you make your lines clear. So I did. I poured the concrete myself, waited the full cure time, sealed every board against weather, made sure every inch was within county code down to the setback requirements. I did not build it fast. I built it right. That is why when I saw how clean it had been removed, how precise the spacing was, how no debris had been left behind, I knew this was not some random act or neighbor dispute. This was planned. Engineered. Approved by someone who thought they had the authority to erase my boundary like it was a pencil mark. Willow Creek Estates had only been here for 3 years, but in that time it had grown from a handful of identical houses into a full grid of driveways, mailboxes, and perfectly trimmed lawns that all looked like they came out of the same catalog. And at the center of it all was Linda Harper, real estate background, HOA president. By unanimous vote, and the kind of person who carried a measuring tape in her purse like it was a weapon. The first time she came to my property, she stood at the edge of my fence and told me my wood tone did not match the community palette. I remember the smell of her perfume mixing with the dust in the air, sharp and out of place, as she pointed at my land like it needed her approval. I told her calmly that my property was not part of the HOA. She smiled like I had just made a suggestion instead of a statement. After that, the letters started. Certified mail. Violation notices. Warnings about visual harmony and property value impact. Each one printed on heavy paper that felt more like intimidation than communication. I kept every single one. Filed. Dated. Logged. Because that is what I do. I track systems until they reveal their pattern. And over the past 6 months, that pattern had become clear. Every time someone resisted, something changed overnight. A mailbox moved. A driveway altered. A structure suddenly out of compliance. Small shifts that pushed people into line without ever leaving a clear fingerprint. Standing there in the heat, looking at the empty stretch where my fence had been, I finally understood. This was not about aesthetics. This was about control. And they had just crossed a line that I had spent my entire life learning how to defend. By the next morning, the neighborhood had already started pretending nothing unusual had happened, sprinklers ticking in perfect rhythm, garage doors opening on schedule, the low hum of leaf blowers filling the air like background noise meant to drown out anything inconvenient, but I could feel it, that subtle shift in how people looked at my property as they drove past, slower than usual, like they were waiting to see what I would do next. Linda Harper did not come alone this time. She brought 2 board members with her, both dressed like they had stepped out of the same catalogue as the houses behind them, clean lines, neutral tones, polite smiles that felt rehearsed. They stood just outside where my fence used to be, not stepping onto my land, not yet, but close enough to make a point. Linda held a folder instead of her clipboard this time, thicker, heavier, the kind of folder people use when they want to look official. "We have reviewed your property situation," she said, voice calm, controlled, like she was explaining something simple to someone who just needed guidance. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as she opened it, the dry Texas breeze catching the edges. Given the previous non-compliance, the association has approved a corrective boundary adjustment to better align with community planning. Corrective boundary adjustment. I let that phrase sit in the air for a second, tasting it, breaking it apart the way I do with engineering reports when something does not quite add up. Because boundaries do not adjust themselves. They are defined, surveyed, recorded. And most importantly, they are not subject to community planning when they exist outside of it. I glanced down at the ground, at the faint line where my posts had been anchored, remembering the exact measurements, the exact coordinates tied to county records that had not changed in over 60 years. "You removed my fence," I said, keeping my voice even, steady, the way you talk when you already know the answer but want to hear how someone explains it. Linda did not hesitate. "The structure was deemed inconsistent with neighborhood standards," she replied, that same polished tone, but there was something else underneath it now, something tighter, like she was used to people backing down at this point. One of the board members shifted slightly, his shoe scraping against the pavement, a small sound but loud enough in the silence that followed. I noticed things like that. Always have. Small inconsistencies. Micro signs that the system is not as solid as it pretends to be. "And the removal?" I asked. Linda closed the folder halfway, her smile returning, controlled, measured. "Handled by an authorized contractor." Authorized. Another word that carries weight when it is backed by actual authority, and collapses when it is not. I nodded slowly, like I was processing it, like I was considering their position. In reality, I was mapping it. Every word. Every claim. Every gap. Because here is what they did not realize. Authority is not something you declare. It is something you prove. And the more Linda talked, the more she revealed exactly where that proof was missing. The sun climbed higher, heat pressing down on the asphalt, the air starting to shimmer just enough to blur the edges of everything. But not enough to hide what was really there. a system built on confidence instead of compliance. A process that assumed no one would push back hard enough to expose it. Linda took a small step closer, just enough to test the boundary that was no longer physically there. "We expect reconstruction to follow approved guidelines," she said, tapping the folder lightly, like she was setting the final terms of a deal. I looked at that empty line of dirt one more time, then back at her. And in that moment, I understood exactly how this was going to play out. They thought they had removed a barrier. What they had actually done was remove the only thing standing between them and a mistake they could not take back. The change did not stop at my fence, it spread quietly through the neighborhood like a system recalibrating itself, small things at first, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying attention the way I do, the way you have to when your entire career depends on catching what everyone else misses, because 2 days after that conversation, I found fresh survey flags planted 6 feet inside my original boundary. Bright orange plastic fluttering in the dry wind like markers of a decision that had already been made without me. I crouched down and pressed my fingers into the dirt where one of them had been driven in, the soil still loose, recently disturbed, not the kind of placement that comes from an official county survey crew, too shallow, too rushed, too careless. The air smelled like sun-baked grass and hot dust, that familiar Texas mix that usually meant stability, routine, something predictable. But now it felt off, like something artificial had been layered over it. By noon, a truck rolled up along the edge of my property, white paint, no company logo, just a magnetic sign slapped on the door that read Boundary Services in plain black letters, the kind you can print overnight. 2 men stepped out, clipboards in hand, moving with that practiced confidence of people who expect not to be questioned. I watched from my porch, the slow creak of the wooden steps under my boots grounding me as I counted their movements, one pacing off distances, the other marking points, both of them working inside a line that did not belong to them. "You are off by 6 feet, I called out, not raising my voice, just stating it the way you state a measurement error on a job site. They paused, exchanged a glance, then one of them turned toward me with a polite smile that did not match his eyes. "We are following HOA-approved adjustments," he said, tapping his clipboard like that settled it. HOA-approved adjustments. There it was again, that phrase, repeated like it could replace actual authority if you said it enough times. I stepped down onto the gravel, each crunch deliberate, closing the distance just enough to see the paperwork he was holding, generic forms, no county seal, no licensed surveyor number, nothing that would hold up under real scrutiny. "You have a county permit for this?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. A small crack in the surface. "We have authorization," he replied instead. Not the same thing. Not even close. I nodded once, stepping back, letting them continue, because sometimes the fastest way to expose a system is to let it run without interruption. By late afternoon, the new line was marked clearly, a straight path cutting across my land like it had always been there, like the last 60 years of recorded boundaries meant nothing. And right at sunset, as the sky turned that deep burnt orange over the hills, Linda's SUV rolled by again, slower this time, window down, her eye scanning the markers with quiet satisfaction. She did not stop. She did not need to. The message was already delivered. They were not just removing my fence anymore. They were rewriting the boundary itself. And standing there, watching those flags catch the last light of the day, I realized this was no longer a disagreement about property standards. This was a full system push, coordinated, confident, and built on the assumption that I would eventually accept it. That I would step back. That I would adjust. The gravel shifted under my boots as I turned toward the house, the heat of the day still radiating off the ground, and for the first time since this started, I let myself acknowledge it clearly. This was not a mistake. This was escalation. And they had just taken it far enough that there was no version of this where I simply rebuilt and moved on. The next morning, I did what any reasonable person would do when faced with something this blatant. I tried to resolve it the right way, through the system they claim to represent, because if there is one thing I have learned over the years, it is that you document first and react second. I drove into Willow Creek Estates just after 9 a.m., the sun already high enough to cast sharp shadows along the identical driveways, each house sitting in perfect alignment like a diagram someone had copied too many times. The HOA office was tucked into a small retail strip at the entrance, glass front, clean signage, the kind of place designed to look official without actually being part of any real governing structure. The air inside was cool, conditioned, carrying that faint scent of printer ink and carpet cleaner, and behind the front desk sat a woman who greeted me with the same rehearsed smile I had seen on every board member. "How can we help you today?" she asked, fingers already poised over a keyboard. I placed a folder on the counter, thicker than anything Linda had carried, filled with survey records, county permits, property deeds going back decades, every document tied to that line they had just decided to move. "I am here to file a formal dispute," I said, keeping my tone even, controlled, because volume does not win arguments, clarity does. She glanced down at the papers, hesitated for just a second, then reached for a form without really reading what I had brought. "You will need to submit this for board review," she replied, sliding a single sheet toward me like that was the solution. 1 page. No reference to jurisdiction. No acknowledgement of ownership outside HOA authority. Just a template designed to process complaints, not resolve them. I filled it out anyway, line by line, writing clearly, attaching copies of everything they would need to see the problem for what it was. While I worked, I could hear the low hum of conversation from an office down the hall, Linda's voice among them, calm, confident, like she was already discussing the next step. When I finished, I handed the form back. "When will I hear a response?" I asked. The receptionist offered that same polite smile. "The board meets once a month. You will be notified after review. Once a month. 30 days. Plenty of time for their version of the boundary. To become normal, accepted, harder to challenge." I nodded, took my copy, and stepped back out into the heat, the sunlight hitting harder after the artificial calm inside. By the time I got back to my property, the survey flags were still there, bright against the dirt, but now there was something new, a temporary sign posted right at the edge of the adjusted line. "Future Community Greenbelt Expansion," printed in bold letters, clean, professional, like it had been ordered well in advance. I stood there for a long moment, reading it twice, then a third time, letting the meaning settle in. This was not about correcting anything. This was about claiming. Expanding. Rewriting ownership under the cover of community improvement. I reached down, picked up one of the flags, and turned it slowly between my fingers, feeling how light it was, how easy it would be to pull out, to erase their version of the line the same way they had erased mine. But I did not. I set it back exactly where it had been. Because removing evidence does not solve a problem. It hides it. And at this point, I needed everything exactly where they had placed it. Every marker. Every sign. Every overstep. As I stepped back, the wind picked up just enough to make the plastic flag flicker again, catching the sunlight like a signal. That was when it became clear. The system I had just tried to use was not designed to stop this. It was designed to delay it, to absorb resistance until people gave up. And I was not going to give them that option. That afternoon, the heat did not let up, it pressed down harder, settling into the ground, into the air, into the back of my neck as I walked the full length of that new line again, slower this time, measuring with my eyes the way I had done on job sites where 1 inch in the wrong place could cost thousands to fix. The flags were still there, untouched, but now there were tire tracks cutting across the edge of my property, shallow impressions in the dirt that had not been there that morning, leading straight through the adjusted boundary like it had already been accepted as a road. I crouched down again, running my hand along one of the tracks, the soil still loose, the edges crisp, recent activity, not planned for later, not pending approval, already happening. The air carried a faint smell of diesel, subtle but distinct, and I followed it with my eyes until I saw the source, a small utility vehicle parked just beyond the line, half on HOA land, half on mine, like someone had decided the distinction no longer mattered. 2 workers were unloading equipment, nothing aggressive, nothing that would raise alarms on its own, just tools, stakes, a rolled bundle of landscape fabric, but placed in a way that suggested permanence, not preparation. I stood up slowly, brushing the dust from my hands, and walked toward them, each step deliberate, steady, the gravel crunching under my boots like a metronome keeping time with everything that was about to unfold. "You setting something permanent?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, the kind of question that sounds casual but is not. One of them looked up, nodded toward the flags. "Greenbelt prep," he said. "We're getting ahead of schedule." Ahead of schedule. That phrase landed heavier than anything else I had heard so far, because it confirmed what I already suspected. This was not waiting on approval, this was operating under the assumption that approval was irrelevant. I glanced past them, back toward my house, then down the line again, connecting the pieces, the overnight removal, the immediate remarking, the pre-printed signage, now active preparation before any official review could even take place. This was not escalation anymore. This was execution. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the county property database, the same records I had reviewed 100 times before, the coordinates fixed, unchanged, legally binding in a way no HOA document could override. I held it up just enough for myself to see, not for them, confirming what I already knew, that line in front of me had not moved in any system that actually mattered. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the dry scent of grass and sun-warmed earth, and for a brief moment, everything felt still again, like the land itself was waiting to see how I would respond. I looked back at the workers, at the equipment, at the quiet confidence in the way they moved, and I realized something important. They were not the decision makers. They were just following instructions, operating inside a system that assumed it would never be challenged at the level it deserved. I nodded once, stepped back, and let them continue, because stopping them now would not fix anything, it would only interrupt a process I needed to fully understand. As I walked back toward the house, the gravel shifting under each step, the weight of the situation settled in completely. They were building on my land. Not hypothetically. Not in planning documents. In real time. And for the first time since this started, I stopped thinking about how to respond within their system. Because it was clear now. Their system was not the one that was going to decide how this ended. It was not the flags or the tracks that gave it away, it was the pattern, the kind you only see when you stop looking at one incident and start connecting them all, because later that evening, as the temperature finally dropped below 90 and the sky faded into that deep blue that always settles over the hills, I walked the outer edge of my property again, not to check the damage, but to study the rhythm of what had been happening, and that is when I noticed something I had missed before. About 200 yards down, near the corner where my land meets the drainage easement, there was another set of markers, older, faded, half-buried, like they had been there longer than the ones planted that morning. I crouched down, brushed away the dry grass, and exposed the top of a metal survey pin, stamped with a county identification number that had not been used in over 20 years. The metal was worn, but still legible, and the placement did not match the new line at all. It matched mine. Exactly. I pulled my phone out again, opened the archived records I had downloaded weeks earlier, and cross-checked the number. Same pin. Same coordinates. Original boundary, still registered, still valid, still untouched by anything Linda and her board had claimed. The air was cooler now, carrying that faint scent of cedar and dust, and for a moment everything felt clear, like the land itself was confirming what the documents already said. They had not adjusted anything. They had ignored it. And then I saw the second detail. Just beyond the old pin, partially hidden behind a cluster of low brush, was a small utility marker, bright yellow, the kind used to indicate underground lines, and that stopped me cold, not because of what it was, but because of where it was placed. Right along my original boundary. I stepped closer, reading the label, tracing the path it suggested, and suddenly the entire situation shifted in my head. This was not just open land. This strip carried something underneath it, something regulated, something that required permits, inspections, clearance. Something no contractor could legally disturb without triggering a chain of consequences far bigger than an HOA dispute. I stood there for a long moment, letting that realization settle in, the quiet hum of insects rising in the distance, the last light of the day catching the edge of that yellow marker like it was trying to point me in the right direction. And just like that, the pieces clicked into place. The overnight removal. The rushed remarking. The immediate push to build. They were not just confident. They were careless. They had assumed the surface was all that mattered. That no one would look deeper. That no one would check what ran beneath the line they were trying to erase. I straightened up slowly, looking back toward the new flags, then toward the workers' equipment still sitting where they had left it, then back down at that marker again. Because this was the crack in their system. The detail they had missed. And in my line of work, the smallest overlooked detail is usually the one that brings everything else down. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, a different kind of calm settling in now, not the quiet patience I had been holding onto before, but something sharper, more precise, like a plan finally locking into place. They thought they had removed a boundary. What they had actually done was expose something they could not see, and once that line was crossed, it was no longer just my problem anymore. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I was already at my desk, the faint smell of coffee mixing with the dry air drifting in through the open window, my laptop glowing with layers of county maps, utility schematics, and archived permits that most people would never think to look at, but this is where things start to make sense if you know how to read them. I zoomed in on my property line, overlaying the original survey coordinates with the current utility grid, tracing that yellow marker I had found the night before, and there it was, running almost perfectly parallel to my boundary, a buried utility corridor registered under state infrastructure protection, not HOA jurisdiction, not even county discretionary control, something much bigger, something that came with its own set of rules, restrictions, and consequences. The line was marked as a protected easement, not for access, but for subsurface infrastructure, the kind that requires certified clearance before any surface work is approved, the kind that triggers automatic review if disturbed without authorization. I leaned back slightly, letting that information settle in, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan above me steady, predictable, unlike everything happening outside. Then I cross-checked the permits. There were none. No filings for excavation. No notices for ground disturbance. No approvals tied to that corridor. Nothing that would justify what they had already started doing. That was the second confirmation. The first was the marker itself. The second was the absence of anything that should have existed if this were legitimate. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, the morning still cool enough to carry the scent of dew on dry grass, the ground firm under my boots as I walked back toward the line. The equipment was still there, untouched from the day before, and the workers had not arrived yet, which gave me exactly what I needed, a clear, uninterrupted look at everything as it stood. I took photos, slow, deliberate, capturing the flags, the tire tracks, the placement of the equipment, and most importantly, the proximity to that yellow marker, making sure every angle showed exactly how close they were operating to something they clearly did not understand. Then I opened the county reporting portal, not the HOA complaint system, not the internal process designed to stall and absorb, but the actual regulatory channel tied to infrastructure protection, the one that does not rely on board meetings or polite conversations. I filled out the report carefully, attaching the images, referencing the coordinates, citing the lack of permits, each detail placed exactly where it needed to be, because in systems like this, precision matters more than volume. When I finished, I did not feel rushed, I did not feel angry, I felt focused, the kind of focus that comes when a problem finally moves into a space where the rules are clear and enforceable. I hit submit, watched the confirmation screen appear, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the field, making the flags flicker again, but now they looked different, less like markers of control and more like evidence waiting to be reviewed. I stood there for a moment longer, looking down the line they had tried to create, then back toward the original boundary that still existed beneath it all, unchanged, unmoved, documented in ways they could not override. Because what they had done was not just cross into my land anymore. They had stepped into a system that does not ignore mistakes. And they had done it without even realizing it. The response did not take long, not in the way HOA letters take weeks to circle back with carefully worded delays, but in the way real systems move when something triggers outside the expected flow, because by mid-afternoon, just as the heat peaked and the air started to shimmer above the dirt, a county truck rolled up along the same line where the HOA crew had been working, white paint, official seal on the door, no magnetic signs, no ambiguity. I watched from the shade of my porch as two inspectors stepped out, their movements calm, methodical, the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what authority you carry. They did not look at me first. They did not look at the house or the driveway or anything that could be considered part of a neighborhood dispute. They went straight to the markers. Straight to the flags. Straight to the yellow utility indicator that had been sitting there long before any of this started. One of them knelt down, brushing the dust off the marker the same way I had the night before, confirming its position, tracing the line with a small handheld device that gave off a faint electronic hum, a sound that cut clean through the still air. The other walked the perimeter slowly, taking notes, snapping photos, documenting everything with a precision that made the entire scene feel different, like it had shifted from assumption to record. I stepped down from the porch and walked toward them, not rushing, not interrupting, just closing the distance enough to be present. The gravel crunched under my boots, the only sound. Besides the soft clicks of their equipment. "You filed the report?" one of them asked without looking up. "Yes," I answered. He nodded once, like that confirmed everything he needed to know. No questions about HOA approvals. No interest in community standards. Just facts, location, and compliance. That is how real authority works. About 10 minutes later, another vehicle pulled up, this one not marked for inspection but tied to utility oversight, a separate layer of the system that rarely shows up unless something has crossed into their domain. The air felt heavier now, not from heat, but from the shift in control, the kind you can feel when a situation moves out of one set of hands and into another. I glanced down the line toward where the HOA equipment had been left, still sitting there, unchanged, like it had been forgotten in a space it did not belong anymore. One of the inspectors stood, looking directly at the placement of the flags, then at the equipment, then back at the marker, connecting the same points I had connected hours earlier, but now with the weight of official review behind it. "There is no clearance here," he said, more to his colleague than to me, but loud enough to carry. Simple words. Final tone. No room for interpretation. I could hear the distant sound of a vehicle approaching, tires on pavement, and when I turned, I saw Linda's SUV coming down the road again, slower than before, her posture already shifting as she took in the scene ahead, the county trucks, the inspectors, the fact that this was no longer something she could manage with a clipboard and a smile. She stopped this time. Did not get out right away. Just sat there for a moment, watching. And for the first time since this started, the balance had changed. Not because I had argued louder. Not because I had pushed harder. But because the right system was now looking at the same line they had tried to erase. And once that happened, there was no version of this where they stayed in control. The air shifted the moment Linda stepped out of her SUV, not in temperature, but in tone, like the entire scene had recalibrated itself around a new set of rules she did not control anymore, and for the first time since I met her, she did not walk with that same measured confidence, her steps slower, more deliberate, heels clicking against the pavement with a rhythm that felt slightly off. She approached the inspectors with that familiar smile, the one designed to smooth things over before they became problems, but it landed differently now, like it had lost whatever authority it used to carry. "There seems to be some confusion," she began, voice calm but tighter than before, gesturing lightly toward the flags and the equipment as if she could reframe the situation with the right words. One of the inspectors looked up from his notes, not dismissive, not confrontational, just direct. "There is no confusion," he said evenly. "This area is under protected easement. There is no record of clearance for any work within this corridor." The word settled into the space between them, simple and final, and I watched the shift happen in real time, the slight pause in Linda's posture, the way her shoulders adjusted, recalculating. "We have community authorization," she replied, that phrase again, but this time it sounded thinner, like it did not quite hold the same weight in this context. The inspector shook his head once, not aggressively, just enough to close that line of argument. "Community authorization does not apply here," he said. This is regulated infrastructure. Any disturbance requires formal approval. Behind them, the second inspector had already moved toward the equipment, documenting its placement relative to the marker, the camera shutter clicking in steady intervals, each image capturing a detail that could not be explained away later. The low hum of the handheld device returned as he scanned along the line, confirming the subsurface path I had traced the night before. Linda glanced briefly toward the equipment, then toward the workers who had not yet returned, then back to the inspectors, her expression tightening just enough to reveal what she was trying to hide. This was not going the way she expected. The sun hung high overhead, casting sharp shadows that made everything look more defined, more exposed, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the inspectors reached into his vehicle, pulled out a bright notice, and walked it over to the nearest stake, securing it in place with a motion that felt routine to him but carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. All activity in this area is to cease immediately. Pending review, he said, more as a statement than a command. No raised voice. No escalation. Just a boundary re-established in terms that actually mattered. I could hear the faint rustle of the paper as it caught the breeze, the bold lettering visible even from a distance, an official mark where there had been none before. Linda stood there, looking at it, then at the line, then briefly in my direction, and in that glance, I saw something that had not been there before, not fear, not anger, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when control slips and there is no immediate way to take it back. The system she had been operating in had just collided with one that did not recognize her authority, and there was nothing she could say to override that. I remained where I was, hands at my sides, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just watching as the structure she had built around this situation began to shift under a weight she had never accounted for, and for the first time since this started, the line between us was no longer something she could redraw. The silence that followed was not empty, it was loaded, stretched tight between the inspectors, the posted notice, and the line that had just been redefined in a way no HOA document could touch, and for a moment, everything slowed down enough for the reality of it to settle in. Linda shifted her weight slightly, her eyes moving from the notice to the equipment, then back to the inspector as if she was searching for a way to reassert control, but there was nothing in front of her that responded to tone or persuasion, only documentation and enforcement. "We can resolve this internally," she said finally, her voice steadier now but stripped of that earlier confidence, like she was trying to pull the situation back into a space she understood. The inspector did not react to the offer, did not negotiate, did not engage with the idea of internal anything. "This has already moved beyond that," he replied, simple, direct, and final. Behind him, the second inspector continued working, marking positions, logging coordinates, each movement deliberate, each step reinforcing the same conclusion. The equipment sitting along the line now looked different, less like preparation and more like evidence, its placement no longer neutral but tied directly to a violation that had been formally recognized. I could hear the faint buzz of a notification from one of their devices, a soft tone that seemed to signal the next phase of the process, something triggered, something logged beyond what was visible here. Linda glanced toward it, then back at the inspector, her posture tightening again, the realization settling in that this was not a conversation she could guide. "We were improving the community," she said, quieter now, as if reframing the intent could somehow change the outcome. The inspector nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Intent does not change jurisdiction," he said, and that was the moment everything locked into place. The system she had been operating in, built on influence, consistency, and the assumption of compliance, had just been measured against one that did not adjust for those things. It either met the standard or it did not. And this did not. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, the posted notice fluttering sharply against the stake, the sound crisp, undeniable, drawing attention to itself with every movement. I watched Linda follow that motion, her eyes lingering on the paper, then shifting briefly toward me, and in that glance, there was no challenge left, no subtle assertion of authority, just the quiet acknowledgement that the line she had tried to redraw had now been defined in a way she could not undo. The inspectors began packing up their equipment, not because they were finished, but because the next steps no longer required them to stay here, the process now moving forward through channels that operate without observation. One of them turned slightly in my direction. "You may want to avoid any activity near this area until clearance is confirmed," he said, not as a warning, but as a precaution, a standard instruction given when something larger has been set in motion. I nodded once, understanding exactly what that meant. As their vehicles pulled away, the dust rising briefly behind them before settling back into place, the space felt different again, quieter, but not empty, not unresolved. The line was still there, the flags still marking it, the equipment still positioned along it, but none of it belonged to the same system anymore. And standing there, with the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the ground, I realized the most important part was already done. I had not rebuilt anything. I had not argued louder or pushed harder. I had simply let the right boundary be seen. And once that happened, everything else followed. The next morning did not come with noise or confrontation, it came with absence, the kind that feels louder than anything else when you know what used to be there, because by 8 a.m., the equipment was gone, every piece of it, the utility vehicle, the stakes they had added, even the temporary material stacked near the line, all of it cleared out like someone had finally realized they were standing in the wrong place. The flags were still there, but now they looked out of place, like remnants of a plan that had already been abandoned. The posted notice remained, secured firmly to the ground, its edges slightly curled from the heat, but still visible, still official, still marking a boundary that no one was stepping across anymore. I walked the length of the line slowly, the morning air cooler, carrying that faint scent of dry grass and dust, the same environment, but a completely different atmosphere. No movement. No quiet setup. No assumptions being acted on. Just stillness. About an hour later, a county vehicle returned, not with inspectors this time, but with a small crew tasked with verification, their process quieter, more procedural, confirming what had already been established the day before. They checked the marker, reviewed the placement, documented the cleared area, and left without needing to say much, because the outcome had already been set in motion. Around midday, I received the first official notice on my phone, a formal acknowledgement that an authorized activity had been identified within a protected corridor, followed by a directive for compliance review tied to the responsible party. No mention of my name. No request for further input. Just confirmation that the system had taken over from there. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to drop again, Linda's SUV passed by once more, but this time she did not slow down, did not stop, did not even glance toward the line that had defined the last few days. The difference was clear. Not avoidance. Recognition. She knew the space was no longer hers to manage. And as the hours passed, the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm, but with something subtle change beneath the surface, like everyone understood, even if no one said it out loud, that there were limits that could not be rewritten just because someone believed they had the authority to do so. I stood near the original boundary as the light softened, looking down at the metal survey pin still marking the line that had never moved, still anchored in the same coordinates it had held for decades. The dirt around it was undisturbed now, the temporary markers standing apart from it like they had never truly belonged. I reached down, brushed the top of the pin clean again, feeling the solid resistance of something that had not shifted, not under pressure, not under assumption, not under someone else's plan. And for the first time since this started, there was nothing left to react to, nothing left to defend in the moment, because the system had already done what it was designed to do. It had corrected the overreach, documented the mistake, and removed the illusion that boundaries could be changed without consequence. I straightened up, looking across the land, the same stretch of ground that had been here long before any HOA, long before any board meeting or policy, and I realized something simple but important. They thought they could erase a line overnight. What they did instead was prove exactly why that line could not be touched in the first place. 3 days later, the final piece arrived, not with noise or confrontation, but with a certified envelope left quietly at the edge of my driveway, the kind of delivery that carries more weight than any conversation ever could. The paper inside was crisp, official, stamped with county authority and cross-referenced with state infrastructure regulation, outlining the violation in language that left no room for interpretation, unauthorized activity within a protected corridor, immediate cessation enforced, and a compliance review initiated against the responsible organization. No mention of me beyond the initial report. No acknowledgement of dispute. Just facts, recorded and acted upon. I stood there reading it once, then again, the faint smell of ink and paper mixing with the warm air, the edges of the document catching the light as if to emphasize every word. By the end of that afternoon, the greenbelt sign was gone, removed as cleanly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the original ground and the line that had never actually moved. The survey flags followed soon. After, not by my hand, but by the same quiet process that had brought everything else into order, one by one, disappearing until all that remained was the original marker and the open space around it. The neighborhood returned to its routine, the same sprinklers, the same driveways, the same carefully maintained appearance, but something underneath had shifted, something subtle but permanent. People drove a little slower past my property now, not out of curiosity, but out of awareness, like they had seen something they could not quite explain but understood enough not to test. Linda Harper did not return, not to my property, not to that line, and from what I heard later, she did not chair the next board meeting either. No announcement. No explanation. Just absence, the kind that follows when authority collapses without needing to be publicly challenged. I did not rebuild the fence right away. I left the boundary open for a while, not because it was unresolved, but because it did not need to be reinforced anymore. The line existed whether it was visible or not, documented in records, backed by systems that do not rely on perception or opinion. Weeks later, when I finally did install something new, it was not just wooden posts. It was measured, permitted, aligned exactly with the original coordinates, but integrated with something deeper, something tied directly into the same regulated corridor they had overlooked, fully compliant, fully protected, and completely beyond the reach of any HOA guideline or interpretation. I worked on it alone, just like the first time, the steady rhythm of tools, the smell of treated lumber warming in the sun, the quiet satisfaction of building something that was not just physical, but definitive. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at it, the line clear again, but different now, not just a boundary, but a statement. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just final. Because in the end, they did not lose because I fought harder. They lost because they stepped into a space where the rules were not written by them. They thought they were removing a fence. What they really did was expose a line that had always been there, one that could not be erased, moved, or rewritten, no matter how confident they were when they crossed it.